When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, like Aloe or Allbirds, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and great marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling, and for shoppers, buying, simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. Nobody does online business better than Shopify. It's home of Shop Pay, the #1 checkout in the world. You can use it to boost conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going through to checkout. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income to upgrade your selling today. That's shopify.com/income.
Fellas, you know Degree Cool Rush deodorant, right? Well, last year they changed the formula, and guys were mad about it. One dude even started a petition. So guess what? Degree heard us, admitted they messed up, and brought the original Cool Rush scent back exactly how it was. And it's in Walmart, Target, and other stores now for under $4. So grab some and remember why its cool, crisp, and fresh scent made it the #1 men's antiperspirant for the last decade. Degree Cool Rush is back, and it smells like victory for all of us.
Choice Hotels get you more for your money so you can maximize any road trip. Like with the road trippers we see here in their natural habitat, the breakfast area at a Comfort Inn. Here's a dad teaching his son how to make waffles, fluffy golden waffles. There's a mom making sure her daughter eats some fruit to avoid the "I'm hungry" from the back seat. And a sibling standoff over the last muffin. This is the cycle of vacation maximizationing in all its glory. Check into more. Book direct at choicehotels.com.
Russian nationalism has a lot of component parts, but among them is this sort of long-standing rivalry with the West and a desire to kind of impose their worldview onto the West and to sort of ultimately make the West pay for, Russia's own feelings of inadequacy sometimes.
Hello, mega orderers. I am Jason Pack, and this is Disorder, a podcast where we try to look behind the curtain and understand the ideas that are lurking behind the shadows and influencing developments that then play out in our mad world. Today, we are joined by David Troy. He's an investigative journalist covering the intersection of technology and democracy. And David is the host of the podcast David Troy Presents. He also writes a monthly column, The Wide Angle, for the Washington Spectator. I've been listening a little bit to David Troy Presents, and it is deep dives into ideas that I think you, the mega orderer, might be interested in. Welcome to the show, David.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me, Jason.
Awesome. So we speak a lot about the role of Russia on this podcast. Russia in the disinformation space, Russian ties to Trump, Russia as a disorderer in places like Libya, Syria, in the Sahel. This is something that you've worked on a lot. If you would present active measures, the kind of Thomas Reed perspective, is there a great continuity between the way the USSR operated in this space as a disorderer and post-Soviet Putin Russia?
Yeah, I think you can make that claim pretty easily. In general, what I think we're dealing with is kind of a continuity of a very durable Russian worldview that really extends back into the Bolshevik era, into the Tsarist era, and you see it come through into this sort of ongoing conflict with the West. Russian nationalism has a lot of component parts, but among them is this sort of long-standing rivalry with the West and a desire to kind of impose their worldview onto the West and to sort of ultimately make the West pay for, Russia's own feelings of inadequacy sometimes. So one way to think about it is that when the USSR ended in 1991, the KGB kind of didn't. And while there were claims made by Gorbachev and others at that time that they were going to reform the KGB and radically change it and alter its power, what ended up happening was you ended up split into the FSB and the SVR, which the SVR being a foreign intelligence outfit and the FSB being domestic. And in many ways, their power actually increased over what it was under the USSR. So with Putin being an old KGB guy, I'm afraid that DNA is baked very deeply into not only the Russian worldview, but into the actual Soviet state, here in the 21st century. And we're dealing with the aftermath of this kind of strategy. And so, people like to say, well, the Cold War ended or whatever. Well, kind of. The Cold War between the U.S. and the USSR went into kind of a détente mode, but the FSB really never stopped doing what it was doing. And what we're seeing now, you saw it where there were revelations that there were all of these birth certificates that were planted in Brazil back in 1989, 1990 under the FSB head Kryuchkov. And those birth certificates have been used to create identities for people that are now stirring up trouble on behalf of Russia in the West.
And you could just jump in there that the Illegals Project, of course, that was all about deep cover, and the people who were planted as illegals in the 1970s or 80s are only able now to be doing their work. So of course, there are more continuities than discontinuities.
Yeah, and it's, when you're dealing with an outfit that's playing on 30, 40-year time horizons, it's not unreasonable to think that, some of the stuff that's happening now has roots 30, 40 years ago. So we in the West have a very biased worldview towards, 4-year election cycles and, very quick changes within elected politics. But the folks that we're dealing with have a different view on things.
Before we delve deeper into the Russian worldview and what we're going to talk about Project Russia, because that's something you've done interesting reporting on, what about in the period right after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Yeltsin period? Was the SVR doing this kind of active measures work, or was there a gap?
Yeah, I think it's difficult to totally say because, a lot of this stuff, in order to say definitively, you'd have to get archival access to things that, are just not really accessible at this point. But, I think we can say that as things transition to being under Putin's control and then he becomes prime minister basically beginning of 2000, he, I think, started to recrystallize a lot of this errant energy that was going on in Russia in the 90s. And, we start to see kind of the strategy that we're dealing with now begin to unfold. And, you could point to the apartment bombings as being one moment where he's consolidating power. So, and I also think that there's a lot of contention over whether something like perestroika and glasnost were in fact kind of strategic retreats of a sense. You could basically say that those strategies allowed a rapprochement with the West that allowed for investment from the West into Russia and a lot of other changes to take place, and giving the intelligence agencies some time to kind of put hooks into the West and also to kind of regroup and figure out what their next phase was going to be. And so from my perspective, that's kind of how I read it. There's some literature towards that effect that you can point to. But again, until we get better archival sources, it's difficult to say with certainty. There's hints of that in the Matrokin archive, things like that. But we'll know more one day.
I want to say that this is a talking point that one hears frequently in the Caucasus. As listeners to Disorder will know, I'm in Tbilisi quite frequently. We've had on the pod the former president of Armenia, Armen Sarkisian. And in the Caucasus, they believe that there wasn't a new Cold War. It's the same Cold War. Yeah. Because they've seen those continuities in their region. In other words, nothing magical happened in 1991, just another phase. And so what? Yeah,
you can even point to like Lenin's new economic program from the 1920s as being a kind of a precursor to the perestroika and glasnost projects. And that's the thing, is that there's really nothing new under the sun. There's kind of these cyclical reappearances of different worldview conflicts that just keep cropping up.
Yeah, and then if we mention Leninism, I, of course, instantly these days think of Bannon and MAGA because it is so Leninist. What is it all about? If they're willing to be commies but then liberalize the economy, what is it that the project has been about other than just staying in power and destabilizing and disordering their enemies? Or have I been correct that it is only about staying in power and disordering their enemies?
I think that's probably 90% of it. I do think that there's disagreement amongst the different factions that are in the mix over what this stuff is about. The Christians think it's about abortion. The gold bugs think it's about, Bitcoin and the gold standard. Others think it's about conflict with China and communism. So, part of the circus act of MAGA and some of the other right-leaning parties operating in Europe is to kind of keep all these plates spinning where everybody thinks that they're all moving towards the same goals, even though they have slightly misaligned perceptions and ideas about what's going on. So as you correctly point out, that ends up translating to, well, how do we just keep this faction in power? Because ultimately all the factions lose out if the combined front doesn't maintain control. And if that collapses, then the game's off for everybody. So they all become enmeshed in this shared project of obtaining and retaining power for power's sake.
Obtaining and retaining power for power's sake. Okay, David, that's an interesting way of presenting things. But was there not a moment, again, right after 1991, when there were pressures for Russia to democratize? And although there may have been Siloviki who wanted to retain power for power's sake, how did they head off these challenges, these pressures, not only supported by the West, but supported by the reformers within Russia to move towards democratization?
Yeah, I think the first thing that people need to kind of grapple with when thinking about the quote-unquote end of the Cold War was that the feeling amongst consensus Western position was that democracy was obviously superior to any of these authoritarian regimes and that it would sort of flourish and break out everywhere and it would be great. And, what we saw was that was very, very difficult to try to actually execute in Russia. And, of course, privatizing all of the state industries rapidly was proving to be a huge challenge, and they brought in famously the whole team from Harvard, and there's the famous paper called How Harvard Lost Russia, all about how
and
the
do you mean Michael
privatization
Porter
process.
And Monitor Group kind of people, or who are you getting at?
Schleifer and Jeffrey Sachs and that network of people, Anders Oslund.
Okay.
And
It's connected to Jeffrey Porter and Monitor Group. Ideas of
there was a
crony
network of people
privatization.
that were engaged in that. Anthony Chubais in Russia
And just to back up and explain to listeners, Anthony Shubais, who was prime minister in the Yeltsin period, is credited for the loans for shares scheme, which essentially allowed the fire sale of Russian state companies, which were the semi-sovereign parts of the Russian government that, for example, had the aluminum monopoly or the ability to develop oil in Siberia and to raise money for the Russian exchequer. These were sold way below their value and created the oligarchic class in Russia. This is a defining moment that we've covered on disorder in our discussions, particularly with Evgenia Karamurza, as well as with Bill Browder. I do think that was a critical moment, but are you saying that Americans and, the PwCs and McKinseys of the world had something to gain from this, or rather that they were kind of unwittingly helping our adversaries?
Well, I think there are a lot of cross currents in there. So if you read that paper I mentioned, How Harvard Lost Russia, it mentions people like Tom Steyer, who, ended up being very enriched by a lot of the investments that were happening in Russia at that time. So people like Browder and Steyer and others, were able to make a lot of money during that time. And, you can hardly blame them. I mean, here's all this stuff going on and they know about it and it's legal for them to invest. And so they did. And the other thing you have to understand is that, like Igor Gaidar and Sergei Glaziev, other economists and advisors and Kremlin people that were in the mix with this, they became actually super mesmerized by Augusto Pinochet and what was going on in Chile in the 1970s. And so, folks familiar with that
Chicago
period.
school stuff.
Exactly. So it was the Chicago boys in Chile, implementing this shock doctrine kind of stuff. And they privatized a ton of stuff, and it didn't work terribly well, but they thought maybe they could do a redo, a mulligan in Russia and try some of the same ideas again. And so, like, Glaziev and others led a delegation to go to Chile to, observe the facts on the ground and learn what they could from the Chilean experiment and then bring that back to Russia. So there was a lot of this kind of thinking that was happening. And the other story that these folks told themselves is that was the only way it was going to work, that there was no other way to kind of like bring this about than rapid, privatization and kind of handing things over to the people that became the, oligarchs. So as a result, you ended up with this kind of kleptocratic state that, was sort of trying to pretend to be a democracy, but kind of couldn't because it didn't really have the sort of constitutional wherewithal to actually execute that form of government. And everybody kind of knew that, but everybody was kind of looking the other way on the grounds that, like, well, this was the way it had to be, and maybe over time it'll get better. And I think people, a little aside, I think people make a mistake in calling what's going on in the United States oligarchy, because really the oligarchy process is what we saw in Russia during this privatization process. You basically had people who became rich because of their proximity to the head of state. In the U.S., what we've typically had is a plutocracy where people who are rich because they made money end up exercising state power. Now, we are starting to see that convert to some extent now, where folks who are close to Trump are getting huge favors.
I just wanted to jump in that the change is happening as we speak, because
exactly.
If Kushner opens a fund and he gets $2 billion from the Emiratis and Saudis, it wasn't that he wasn't rich before, but he was not at the oligarchic level of rich. But he and Don Jr. and others who are doing these rug pulls of meme coin and stuff are now converting proximity to power into oligarchic
Correct.
levels of wealth.
Yep, and so that's kind of the thing that we've been going through in the U.S. is converting from plutocracy to oligarchy, and I think we have lessons that can be learned from Russia's experiment with this. Is that an oligarchy really can't support what we think of as a democracy, and you see that play out in Russia in the first 25 years of this century. So.
Now, that was an interesting way of phrasing it. You say that oligarchy can't support a democracy. Why is it phrased in that causality? Isn't it rather that Russia had a chance to become a democracy and instead became an oligarchy, rather than that oligarchy can't support democracy?
Once you become an oligarchy, I don't know that it's easy to sort of actually become a democracy at that point, because you have so much power concentrated in so few people that are connected to the state. To me, just naively looking at it, I think it would be very difficult for those people to then lose power, which is, I think, a condition for democracy, that, you need to have it be possible for people to lose power. And I'm not sure that under the current setup in Russia, that's likely.
Right. And this is important in the view that even if Putin, for example, would die of a heart attack or lose in Ukraine and be ousted, it's not that all of a sudden you're going to have a democracy, because the oligarchic power centers, for example, at Rosneft and in Surgutneftegas and in other institutional concentrations of power, will still be the same. That's your analysis?
Yeah, and also, I mean, you've got successors lined up for Putin. People like Patrushev are very likely to step into that role, and there's others.
Really? Could you tell us more about your thoughts there?
Well, he's currently, high up in the intelligence infrastructure. I forget whether he's current head of the FSB or has been, but, he's very close to Putin and an advisor. Can look up and see exactly what his current role. But that's the name that I keep hearing from my Russian analyst friends, is Nikolai Patrushev.
You've done a lot of work and podcasts on what is called Project Russia. So why don't you give us a little bit of an introduction to Project Russia? Why is it important for Americans to understand it? What is it exactly?
Sure. So Project Russia is an ideological framework that was published in a series of books in Russia between 2005 and 2010. And it was initially published anonymously and distributed to cultural influencers, people in government, people high up in the Kremlin hierarchy. And it is believed to have been commissioned by the Kremlin. And over time, by 2010, we learned the name of some of the authors of it. Effectively, these were folks that were, part of the Kremlin influence structure. And what they basically outlined was a strategy for undermining the West and a justification for doing so. They basically said that democracy is fundamentally flawed. They say it's decadent, that voters are very easily swayed and have kind of the same mindset as children, that they don't have either enough information or enough domain expertise to actually be entrusted with making any decisions about anything practically. And so therefore, it's just kind of a doomed, failed project that feeds the vanity of Western leaders to give them an air of legitimacy, and that the real strings in democracies are pulled from behind the scenes through the exercise of other kinds of power or through influence or social media or, whatever. So a very cynical view of democracy, as one would imagine. They also posit that Russia is blessed with a kind of built-in religious worldview, and that particularly the Orthodox Church gives Russians a kind of a armor that will protect them in their ongoing battle with the West. And it is very important that all Russians adopt at least some level of basic spirituality, because that is the difference between, the Russian worldview and the kind of democratically led West. And then furthermore, there's a lot of griping around the dominance of the US dollar and dollar hegemony. So, if you think about how Putin sees the world, he thinks that the dollar is an unfair device because Americans can print it at will through the Federal Reserve, and that they believe that profligacy with money enables American military adventurism. So therefore, they think that all of American hegemony is rooted in the dollar, and that the best thing in the world that could happen would be to eliminate the Federal Reserve and the US dollar, replacing it with some kind of hard currency, whether that's gold, silver, crypto, or variants thereof.
Isn't it interesting then that all of the actions of our current president appear to be promoting this ideology?
Yeah, I'd say that it's a bit of a coincidence, right? And so, this Project Russia thing is not the only such place where this ideology is either outlined or executed, but it's one of the major places where you can find all these things together. And what's interesting about Project Russia is that these books, which are several hundred pages in length, really have not been translated into English meaningfully. There's a couple of academic papers that reference it, and I've done the work to translate those volumes.
Are you a Russian speaker?
No, but I've done it using computer tools and, with the limitations that brings.
And would you say that this is essentially the Mein Kampf of the Putin regime as relates to its interactions with the U.S. and the West in the last 12 years?
I'd say it's one of a few such things. I mean, it's certainly where there's probably the most concentration of signal in a single source. There's other things that you can look at, like there's something called the Strategic Culture Foundation that has fueled a ton of websites that contain similar themes. But I'd say that it's, if you want like a good place just to see an encapsulation of what Russia thinks it's doing, this is a really good place to look.
I'm going to come back to the Mein Kampf analogy, though, because what Mein Kampf was important for was not only Hitler's articulation, after the beer putsch of what he really stood for, but it was important as a kind of constitution to rally enough elites to his cause, right? In other words, the difference in 1933 to in 1921 is he could get various industrialists and retired World War I generals on board to, have the Enabling Act passed. And that he had a manifesto and a program was very important. And if we look at other ideological, political manifestos. I'm quite knowledgeable about the Green Book in Libya because when I lived in Libya, I worked on the Green Book. But if you look at Mao's Red Book, it was the existence of this treatise that allowed a certain cadre of forces to work together to achieve certain aims. How is Project Russia a corpus that allows the Alexander Dugins or other technologists to work together, maybe Prigozhin before he was dead, to support this Ruski Mir and various ideas of the Kremlin?
Yeah, I think you make a good point in that what this functions, in terms of how it actually works in a society, is you put this out there and it creates a kind of common direction that people that are aiming to engage in this, they can all be sort of working from the same songbook without explicitly coordinating. And a lot of times I think people have the idea that there's sort of this grand conspiracy and all these people are talking to each other. But when you publish your grand conspiracy out in a series of books that then sells millions of copies, which it did in Russia, several million of these copies
So
of
Project
these were
Russia
sold.
is the title of a series of books or just one
A
book?
series of books, multiple books between 2005 and 2010. And they became conversation pieces, things
Would
that
you
people
say it's
were
like
aware
the
of.
Federalist Papers? They evolve over time between different authors?
It seems to be a small set of authors. It's not clear who wrote like the first two and the last two, were people actually who ended up being connected to a company called American Ethane, which was the major backer of Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House. But yeah, I mean, I think these books did make the rounds, and it enabled a kind of ideological coordination that allowed a harmonized set of strategies and points of view without having to directly, call up people and tell them, "Here's the plan." The plan was published. It also makes assertions about, the hierarchy of men over women and that, the primary responsibility is to the family. A lot of very traditionalist views that are embedded now into the church. And of course, it's been widely reported that, networks like the Russian Orthodox Church, both inside and outside Russia, have become essentially organs of the FSB apparatus. You see that in, like Jared Kushner and Ivanka, they are aligned with that Russian flavor.
Back to Project Russia. So why is it important for Americans or Westerners and Brits to understand what Project Russia is and why it exists?
Well, I think you look at somebody like a Jake Sullivan as kind of a cautionary tale. Respect Jake Sullivan, his experience, his role, what he had to deal with, and for those that don't know, he was the national security advisor under Joe Biden. At the end of the day, he's got this kind of Western worldview, it seems, that projects Western ideas about what people's motivations are onto, the Russian people, onto Putin. And I think that in general, we don't tend to understand Russian motivations that well. And I think that particularly in Washington, and I can say that as somebody that's, existed in the Washington context, living in this area for a long time, there tends to just be groupthink that develops over time. And people start to think, oh, Putin's a rational actor. He is going to do this. He is going to do that because, we believe that, he's after natural resources or something. We come up with some reason that's going to justify their actions. And what you don't understand is that these folks are motivated by grievances, by pride, by historical ideas that are perhaps even false.
I just need to jump in here. This is what we've been saying on this podcast for 150 episodes because the root of this idea for the disorder listener is my concept of the global enduring disorder, which says we need the change in understanding foreign policy that happened in economics when we moved to behavioral economics, right? The problem with realist IR theory and constructivist IR theory is that it assumes that a rational actor maximizes the interests of his state, but no one maximizes interests. Biden isn't busy looking at the U.S. and saying, how can I maximize widget production? Because we have pet projects, and we have emotions, and we have people that we're connected to. And why would Russia be different? Of course.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, the primary difference with Russia is that their history and it's the story that they've told themselves about civilization and their role in it is a very different story than the one that, the Westerners have adopted. So the idea that we can take Western ideas and project them into Russia is just dumb. And they don't read the history. They don't understand the grievances. They don't understand the point of view. And as a result, we end up coming up with wrong conclusions about what their motivations are and what our policies should be. So, I think you just have to kind of really spend some time respecting and then getting into the head of either your adversary or potentially what could be a partner if you figured out how to, work with them. Although I think in the case of Russia, that's difficult.
I think the problem here with that word partner, and you were probably going to get to this, so I'm not disagreeing, but coming in from my perspective is that the very essence of the Project Russia or the Siloviki state project is a need for victory and survival.
Yeah.
And that victory and survival is not something that we can tolerate. And I think that
No, I agree.
And the Bannonites really understand this. Whether or not they are Russian agents, they think that it is possible to quote unquote pull Russia away and work with Russia against China. The problem is that if the Russian interests is a weaker and disordered West and a disordered world which is safe for autocracy because democracy is so discredited, I'm not sure that they're right that is, a feasible goal. How would you address that Bannonite idea of what we should do is have a purely American Christian civilization which can work with Russia?
Yeah, I mean, I think also it's not realistic that Russia could be pulled away from China because they're so dependent on China's natural resources and just general, future. They're very tightly bound, and I think they've made that pretty clear at this point. China has been implicitly and explicitly supporting different aspects of the Ukraine war. They entered into a very, formal kind of enduring friendship back in 2022 that a lot of people wrote off as just being performance or something, but I don't see any reason to think that wasn't fundamentally real. The one of the primary grievances that, is embedded in the Project Russia idea is this idea of the golden billion that Putin talks about, where, he believes that there's basically a conspiracy between the U.S. and Europe to have, the billion richest people on the planet dominate everybody else. And so what they want to do is to take the U.S. and Europe down a peg and balance out, relationships between Russia, China, India, and everybody else. And, that's all internally consistent. So, yeah, I think Bannon is probably the least coherent actor in this whole theater at this moment, I think, because I think he's hoping for things that don't appear to be on offer. Even though he's been willing to kind of go to bat for a lot of things that Russia wants, I think that his goals kind of don't make sense at this point, if they ever really did. But yeah, it's interesting, how different people think this is going to play out in their favor, and they're playing with fire.
After the break, we're going to hear about another interesting Russian idea, Russian Cosmoism.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
My name is Lily, and I've had hidradenitis suppurativa, HS, for years. I finally found some relief since taking Cosentyx. Relief means I can show up more.
Cosentyx secukinumab is prescribed for adults with moderate to severe hidradenitis suppurativa, HS. Don't use if you're allergic to Cosentyx. Before starting, get checked for tuberculosis. An increased risk of infections and lowered ability to fight them may occur, like tuberculosis or other serious bacterial, fungal, or viral infections. Some are fatal. Tell your doctor if you have an infection or symptoms like fevers, sweats, chills, muscle aches, or cough, had a vaccine or plan to, or if inflammatory bowel disease symptoms develop or worsen. Serious allergic reactions and severe eczema-like skin reactions may occur. Learn more at 1-844-COSENTIX or Cosentix.com.
Ask your dermatologist about Cosentix.
We're back with Dave Troy. You've done an excellent job of explaining what is Project Russia, what are some of the deeper ideas behind Putin's misinformation, disinformation campaigns, and desire to confront the West, work with China, and disorder the international arena. Could you tell us what is Russian Cosmoism and what impact is it having now?
Yeah, so Russian Cosmoism is really a core of Russian nationalism. And for those that are interested in learning more about this, there's a good free book by a Russia expert named Marlena Laruelle called Russian Nationalism, Imaginaries, Doctrines, and Political Battlefields by Marlena Laruelle. And the first chapter of her book, because it's this central, is about Russian Cosmoism. And Russian Cosmoism is really a sort of movement that I would say got its roots over the last 150, 200 years. The sort of canonical person that people point to as the originator of this is a guy named Fedorov. But, this idea that there's a connection between our position here on Earth and our position in the space and in the solar system and what have you. And it really gets at Russian ideas about science and how they think that, science should be in the service of solving problems for humanity. And so one of the key problems that they think that humans have is like the problem of death. So a part of Russian Cosmoism is really dedicated to the idea that we can resurrect the dead. Now, there's a problem with resurrecting the dead, which is that if you resurrected all the dead and then tried to have them hanging out here on Earth, you would quickly run out of room. So this creates a mandate for colonizing space. So then this creates this whole chain of logic around figuring out how to build rockets to leave the Earth, to colonize space, so that we can resurrect the dead in space. Now, you might think, all right, well, this is pretty crazy, and what the hell does this have to do with anything? Well, the problem is that a lot of these ideas have kind of made their way into the contemporary conversation around artificial intelligence and sort of our ideas about technology and rocketry. So, our token space weirdo, Elon Musk, is going around quoting from a guy named Tsiolkovsky, who was a Russian cosmist who came a bit after Fedorov. And Tsiolkovsky was the guy who worked out the equations for rocketry. And again, to solve this problem of resurrecting the dead. And Tsiolkovsky's quote, on this topic is that, the Earth is like a nursery, it's like a cradle, and that we can't stay, in the cradle forever. We have to become spacebound and go out and explore this stuff. So all of Musk's rhetoric about, becoming a multiplanetary species is quite parallel to Russian Cosmoism. And others, have noticed this. I'm certainly not the only one that, has made this observation. And so there's a philosopher by the name of Emil Torres, who's a contemporary writer, who has coined a term called TESCREAL, which stands for transhumanism, extropianism, singularitarianism, cosmism, rationalism, effective altruism, and long-termism, which is basically lumping all of these things into a single basket, perhaps somewhat unfairly, but they share a certain amount of common ideological heritage. And we see this kind of TESCREALism, as Emil calls it, manifesting itself in the tech world quite a bit. So people are basically becoming a bit cultish about AI. And if you hear all the stuff about AI risk and the probability of doom coming about from the development of AI, that's where all this stuff kind of comes from. So the fact that there's kind of a direct root between Russian nationalism and some of these tech ideas that seem to be taking hold in a kind of a cultish way, I think is worth noting. And some people will acknowledge those linkages. Others think it's more of a coincidence, or that these things are, just sort of aligned in a surface way. But I think in order to really understand the big picture, you have to be able to kind of look at those things all at once and get a sense of, why Cosmoism, for example, is at the root of Russian nationalism. And again, when we think about Russia's motivations, hardly anybody you talk to will start talking about Russian Cosmoism as being the core of Russian nationalism. But in fact, one of the leading experts on Russia has placed Russian Cosmoism at the very root of Russian nationalism. So I think it is highly relevant. And again, it's an example of our ignorance of this is an example of how the West fails to understand the Russian mindset.
Given that these AI founders, as well as some kleptocratic con men like Sam Bankman-Fried, are attracted to bizarre ideologies like effective altruism, how would you say that Russian ideas of cosmism cross over to every kind of weird libertarian futuristic ideology in Silicon Valley? What's the ideological connection there?
Well, I think there's several different bridges that you can look at. One is if you look at folks like, Ayn Rand, who fled Russia and became a successful novelist in the United States, really writing about libertarian topics. The fundamental idea that she settles on, particularly in Atlas Shrugged, is this idea of libertarian exit, where, basically the entrepreneurs and the makers, the doers, they decide that, they're going to check out and go hang out at Galt's Gulch and do their own thing. That idea became incredibly influential on tech founders. And it really is this idea of libertarian exit, the idea that if you don't like sort of the regime that you're living under, you're going to take your toys and go home and go do something else.
And this idea has a very long pedigree going back to Rousseau and others, which is that whenever government seems to be oppressive, and what might be oppressive to them is not oppressive to you and I, you as the creative individual, the Howard Rourke of the world, should just go and found your own community or bugger off and deal with only like-minded people.
And maybe that place, if you really need to get away from Dodge, is like Mars. So to some extent, you can see that as a logical extension of that kind of thinking. And you're already seeing speculation about, well, if we do colonize Mars, which, by the way, I think is highly speculative, what will the laws be like? Who will govern it? What will there be taxes on Mars? Seems to obsess a lot of libertarian types. So, again, I think those ideas are deeply embedded in there. But I do think that, this idea of libertarian exit is exhibited in some of what we're seeing now, and just, for a variety of reasons has alignment in what Russia's trying to do. Because at the end of the day, if you look at movements, there's a movement, in Silicon Valley called the network state right now, which is basically trying to set up a new country on the internet. That idea is fundamentally antagonistic to American governance. Like, you really don't want a bunch of people in the United States claiming to have left the United States and forming their own country on the internet. That erodes American power and sovereignty. However, that is very much what Russia would like to see happen. So right now, the network staters and the Russians are more or less aligned in their goals.
And I would say that the Russian cosmists and any kind of extreme libertarian Ayn Rand Cato Institute person in the U.S. are able to find common cause because they both want a U.S. government which can't regulate things and doesn't have a strong Federal Reserve and is not able to fund the roads and the bridges. All of this leads me to ask the question, what, if anything, can you point to has Donald Trump done which is not in line with Russian interests and ideology that we've been discussing?
Yeah, I mean, I basically spend a lot of my time monitoring that and asking that question. I would say that occasionally he goes off script and does stuff that's puzzling. So, like right now, he has harsh words for Vladimir Putin and the fact that he hasn't ended the war. That could be performance art. It could be a kind of narcissistic injury where Trump is sad that he's not as important as he thought he was, and he thought that he could solve all this with Putin and be a world historic character immediately. Or maybe he's using it as leverage to try to extract something out of Putin. It's hard to say.
If you were Agent Krasnov and you needed to keep your cover, you would come into office saying, I'm going to sanction those Russians until they this, that, and the other.
Yeah.
Then you wouldn't sanction them. And then you would say, but I really dislike that you made those bombings in Kyiv. But then you would not actually do the consequence.
Yeah, and I think there may be some of that kind of performance art going on between them. So I think that's worth watching. I am of the belief that, these tariffs are actually pretty helpful to Russia. I think that's very much aligned with Russia's goals for isolating the United States. So I think that's a win on their part.
I was going to ask you more about that. So we're speaking at the end of May. How would you explain to the listener what has happened with the role of the Supreme Court and other courts in trying to take away Trump's ability to make the tariffs, that he doesn't have those emergency powers to put tariffs on Canada and Mexico and violate the USMCA, but then his powers to do so being reinstated? What is your overall simplification of how this issue has played out?
I mean, it's chaos is really what we're dealing with. And, when this first got rolled out at scale back at the beginning of April, I mean, obviously everybody was super freaked out and created a lot of market chaos. And, we're still sorting out, what the details are of like what's real, what's him just sort of being capricious. So I think, we're very much in the process of sorting this now. And I think it was just, an appeals court upheld his right to impose tariffs. So I don't know that all of this has made its way to the Supreme Court yet. I think there's still, rope to play out there. But, I think some reporter asked Trump about the fact that some Wall Street traders had identified the phrase taco, which stands for Trump always chickens out, as a kind of trade that one could execute. Because, basically Trump says crazy thing on Friday. Stock goes down, people buy the stock goes up when Trump chickens out on Monday or Tuesday or whatever it is, and then people make money. And so Trump apparently thought that was highly offensive and that he wasn't doing anything of the sort, and of course he would never chicken out.
But we're just chickening out with the Chinese, where we've dropped some tariffs if they drop some retaliation without having achieved anything.
Yeah, it really doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense other than to try to erode American power. And the idea that we're going to spawn a whole bunch of, highly specialized manufacturing in the United States, I think is unrealistic.
And not only that, it's particularly unrealistic if you put the tariffs on and then you delay them for 90 days and then you change them.
Yeah, because nobody believes that it's real, because it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. And also, I mean, people talk about, how much would it cost to manufacture an iPhone in the United States? And the answer is infinity dollars, because it's not going to happen. It's just not doable because we don't have the supply chain stuff set up here to even start to do that. We don't have the machine tools. We don't have the operators. And, they have those kinds of numbers in China. So I think it's just chaos, and I think that helps Putin. And, in terms of other things that Trump may be doing that might not align with the Russian vision is continuing to raise the debt ceiling, I think is not in line with what the Russian signal says. So right now, when I think about Russian signal in the United States, I look to a few key sources. One is Rand Paul, another is Thomas Massie. There's a few media type folks, sort of the Benny Johnson, Tim Pool type folks that you can look to towards pretty reliable signal. And then, Trump is Trump, and Trump sometimes is aligned with the Russian signal, sometimes isn't. But as you say, sometimes I feel like it's a tactical feint in order to kind of appear to not be as aligned with Russia as he might ultimately be.
Let us order the disorder together, Dave. We like to close out the Disorder Show by presenting the mega orderers with some solutions. We've talked about this kind of overall ideological matrix of Russian strategy, Russian ideology, Russian desire to weaken the West, disorder the West. Now I would like to pivot to solutions. Why don't you provide a solution or two for me that would shore up democracy within the West?
Sure. So one of the solutions that I've been working on is building a network of people that are interested in kind of creating a network of people that are trying to advance democracy throughout the world. And what I'm using as a framework for that is a 1939 book written by a guy named Clarence Streit called Union Now that talks about how to network the world's democracies in order to prevent war. And it really is an alternative vision to the League of Nations. And ultimately, the UN, after World War II, recapitulated a lot of the flaws of the League of Nations. Clarence Stride envisioned was more of a political union rather than a kind of a league or something like NATO, which is really a defensive union. And so these ideas are pretty wacky because nobody's really talked about them since 1939 in many cases. But I'm finding that there's a lot of interest in that. So I'm engaging people in Europe and Brussels and Germany and Switzerland and all around the world to start to have this conversation more in earnest. And we're starting small. And I don't think that my solution is the only good solution. I think there's a lot of other people doing good things too. But we basically have outgrown the institutions that we were left with in the wake of the post-war
Well, you're just
order.
preaching to the choir here. I mean, again, what do I write in my book, Libya and the Global Enduring Disorder? It's that we created all these amazing institutions at the end of World War II, not just the UN, but the IMF and Bretton Woods and everything.
Yeah, the whole works.
And then at the end of the Cold War, we didn't create any institutions, and the only treaty that we really had is the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, and then we didn't enforce it. So
Right. And we thought
have,
that these old institutions would somehow or another work forever
we
without any
obviously
renewal.
needed post-Cold War institutions
Yeah.
that would seed and link together democracy in a new way. And we certainly need post-internet and post-social media and post-disinformation institutions
Absolutely.
that will be able to stand up to AI and misinformation and do the fact-checking and link together Democrats. So, that's exactly what we're all about. And what I would like to ask you is, you mentioned this 1939 work and you mentioned what you're doing. Could you explain in one paragraph what the idea is and how it might come into being?
Yeah, so basically what Streit proposed was networking the world's largest democracies. He proposed 15 democracies at the time, and it would be kind of the usual suspects from our perspective. The US, UK, much of Europe, Australia, what have you. And the idea being that, you sort of create this democracy club. Everybody in the democracy club gets access to like a Bill of Rights, and it would be a totally analogous type structure to the creation of the United States out of the 13 colonies. And folks don't remember, but because they weren't there, none of us were. But back in 1780s, the colonies were fighting with each other over various things,
Of course.
and tariffing each other, and had all
Yes.
kinds of, internal conflicts that were pretty unproductive. And, by coming up with this union idea, they were able to be like, okay, these several things we can agree on, and so we can stop fighting over these dumb things, and we can get on with, doing actual other work. And so that worked out well, and it created a 250-year run that we're going to be celebrating next year. So Clarence Streit basically said the same thing needs to happen with countries, and the reason why it needs to happen at the global level in 1939, from his perspective, is because of exactly what you said: technology. He called it machinery of governance, and the machinery of communication and trade had gotten to the point where we effectively were a global species, but we weren't governing ourselves globally, and so. If it was true in 1939, it's really true in 2025. And we just basically have ignored what is a very obvious problem for like the last 85 years.
Lumping together Russian Cosmoism and Project Russia, essentially this Russian ideology of a spiritual nationalism connected to the Ruski Mir and the Orthodox Church and whatever. What is your solution? In other words, what should be done in America and the EU and the UK if we truly understand these things? How should we relate to Russia differently?
Well, I think, the first thing is Western media needs to adopt a much more just self-aware, point of view in terms of evaluating Russia and their goals. I think that, a lot of the media coverage is very simplistic. A lot of it ignores the history. So I think better media is certainly one area that we could improve things in. The other thing is,
But how do we get to that better? How do we get to that better media when journalists can't make a living anymore?
well, and this is the kind of work that I'm doing, where I'm lucky enough to be able to kind of pursue this because I feel like it's the right thing to do. I think we are seeing more journalists go independent and kind of pursuing these things on their own and building up enough of a fan base to make a living without the, sort of support of media institutions. But it's going to be that kind of a transformation where, people need to start to be more responsive to this kind of stuff. And I think, you start to change the consensus slowly over time. And, even the New York Times, which unfortunately and unfortunately in some ways is still kind of a standard bearer, posted a new article that covered a lot of this terrestrial type stuff, the Russian Cosmoism. And I've been writing about this for 3 or 4 years. But they just did it today. So, better late than never. And maybe in the future, we'll get the New York Times to only be a year late versus 3 years late, But, that kind of stuff I think can help. And also I think that, what I mentioned at the beginning about, forming a network of democracies, that is how you deal with Russia. You basically need to start to orient the world towards unifying democracies against countries that don't want to participate in democratic processes.
Okay, so I want to push back there. The Northern Hemisphere democracies are very united, other than Trump, or they were very united under Biden, but we've done a very poor job with the global South democracies. The South Africas and Chiles and Argentinas of the world are not interested in our project. They say, and India, being the world's largest democracy, is either pro-Russian or is agnostic. What can be done to try to get the global South democracies to want to participate?
Well, I think we need to work on our soft power game. And unfortunately, we've been blowing up all of our soft power assets over the last few years. So that's, a setback that we're going to have to try to overcome. But I think also, even if we, just start with the North Atlantic democracies and actually renew our commitment to some kind of global vision. The thing is, we don't have a vision for the future. We just don't have one. The authoritarians and the autocrats, they have a plan at least. And it's kind of easy to see what it is, So I feel like we need a story that we can tell that's at least as good as what the autocrats and the authoritarians are telling. And this is how you win over the global South.
Amazing. Let's wrap there because that connects us to our amazing episode with George Monbiot, where he said, what you need is a story. You need the world was thrown into disorder and disarray, and then came an orderer who wanted to make things better for regular people. And to do that, you need to, for example, have a treaty align with other democracies. And it was the mistake, I would argue, of David Cameron when he went into the referendum, and Biden and Harris as they went into this election, to not tell a story of how what they were doing was about regular people and making their lives better. It was a great pleasure having you on the show, Dave. I think that we think very similarly, and I would like to direct the listeners to your America 2.0 news site, as well as to your podcast, which is very conveniently called David Troy Presents. So we're going to put a lot of links in the show notes in the Substack, and we hope to do more with you going forward. As always, our producer has been the one, the only, the George McDonough. Please check out the links in the show notes for the Substack, where we're going to give you more stuff that Dave does. And I am wishing you a very orderly week. Thank you. Hello, mega orderers. We strive in partnership with the new production company Evergreen to create the best possible listening experience for you, the orderer. We appreciate your feedback about the show. We want to learn about you. What topics would you like? What kind of sponsors do you want to hear about? How we have a better experience? If you go to theshowsurvey.com/disorder, you can take a short anonymous survey and you will be entered in a drawing to win a $100 or £100 Amazon gift certificate. Again, that's theshowsurvey.com/disorder. Quick survey. It helps the show. And each week we will select a winner from participating. So you have a really high chance of winning That's you, mega orderers. Go fill out the survey.